The sand whispers secrets of the dead, and tonight we're diving deep into one of history's most haunting resurrection stories. Not the one you might expect, but something far older, far stranger, and infinitely more brutal. We're talking about Osiris, the Egyptian god who experienced a death so horrific it would make modern horror films seem tame by comparison. This isn't your typical mythology lesson where gods float around on clouds looking majestic. This is a story of jealousy, betrayal, and a murder so savage that it literally tore apart the fabric between life and death itself. You think you know resurrection stories? Think again. What happened to Osiris makes every other tale of coming back from the dead look like a gentle afternoon nap. By the time we're done tonight, you'll understand why ancient Egyptians were so obsessed with death, why they spent fortunes on mummification, and why they believed the afterlife was more real than the world of the living. Because Osiris didn't just die and come back. He was butchered, scattered across Egypt like puzzle pieces, and somehow managed to rule an entire kingdom from beyond the grave. If you're settling in for the night, maybe grab something warm to drink, because we're about to journey back over 4,000 years to a time when gods walked among mortals, when the Nile River ran red with divine blood, and when death was just the beginning of an even stranger story. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight, because I love seeing our little community of mythology lovers from all corners of the world coming together to explore these ancient mysteries. Now, dim those lights and get comfortable, because the story of Osiris begins not with his death, but with his birth into a world already poisoned by cosmic jealousy and divine dysfunction. Picture ancient Egypt at the dawn of creation, when the gods themselves were still figuring out how to rule both heaven and earth. The sun god Ra had established order, but that order was fragile, constantly threatened by the forces of chaos that lurked just beyond the edges of reality. Into this precarious world came Osiris, born to the sky goddess, Nut, and the earth god, Geb. But this wasn't just any divine birth. According to the ancient texts, Nut had been cursed by Ra himself, forbidden from giving birth on any day of the year. The curse seemed unbreakable until Thoth, the god of wisdom, gambled with the moon and won 5 extra days that didn't officially belong to any year. On these stolen days, Nut gave birth to 5 children, and Osiris was the first. From the moment of his birth, Osiris was different. Where other gods embodied single aspects of existence, Osiris seemed to contain multitudes. He was the god of fertility, yes, but also of the underworld. He represented life in all its abundance, but also death in all its finality. The ancient Egyptians saw no contradiction in this. To them, Osiris was the living proof that life and death weren't opposites, but 2 sides of the same cosmic coin. As Osiris grew to maturity, he became everything a god-king should be. Tall and handsome, with skin the color of fertile black earth, he possessed wisdom that surpassed even the oldest deities. His voice could calm storms, his touch could make the desert bloom, and his presence brought prosperity to every corner of Egypt. The people adored him, the other gods respected him, and it seemed like nothing could threaten his perfect reign. But perfection, as we all know, has a way of breeding resentment. And in the shadows of Osiris's golden kingdom lurked his brother Set, the god of chaos, storms, and the desert. Set watched his brother's success with growing bitterness, his heart slowly hardening into something darker than the deepest tomb. Where Osiris brought life, Set brought destruction. Where Osiris was loved, Set was feared. And where Osiris ruled with wisdom and compassion, Set could only dream of power and revenge. The ancient text describes Set as everything Osiris wasn't. Where Osiris was tall and stately, Set was compact and muscular, built like a warrior rather than a king. His skin was the color of red sand, his hair wild and unkempt, his eyes holding the unstable fury of a desert sandstorm. But perhaps most telling of all was his sacred animal, not the noble ibis or the majestic cat, but the Set animal, a creature so strange and terrifying that modern archaeologists still can't agree on what it actually was. Some say it was a kind of prehistoric dog, others claim it was purely mythological, but all agree it perfectly represented Set's chaotic nature. The tension between the brothers had been building for decades, maybe centuries. Every festival celebrating Osiris's wisdom was another knife twist in Set's pride. Every harvest blessing, every flood that brought fertility to the Nile Delta, every prayer of gratitude offered to Osiris was another reminder to Set of what he could never be. The people didn't just prefer Osiris, they genuinely feared Set, and that fear bred a kind of desperate isolation that slowly poisoned Set's divine essence. But Set was patient, cunning in the way that only the truly desperate can be. He knew he couldn't challenge his brother directly. Osiris was too powerful, too beloved, too protected by the cosmic order that Ra had established. So Set began to plan something far more subtle and infinitely more cruel. He would destroy Osiris not through direct confrontation, but through betrayal so complete that it would shake the very foundations of divine law. The plan that Set devised was both brilliant and horrifying in its simplicity. He would host a great feast, a celebration supposedly in honor of his brother's continued reign. All the gods would attend, along with the most important mortals from across Egypt. There would be music and dancing, the finest foods and wines, entertainment worthy of the gods themselves. And at the center of it all would be a gift so magnificent, so perfectly crafted, that Osiris wouldn't be able to refuse it. Set commissioned the finest craftsmen in all of Egypt to build a sarcophagus. But this wasn't just any burial chest. This was a masterpiece of artistry and engineering, made from the rarest woods, inlaid with gold and precious stones, decorated with hieroglyphs that told the story of eternal life. Every measurement was perfect, every detail flawless. It was, without question, the most beautiful sarcophagus ever created, and it was built to fit exactly one person, Osiris himself. The night of the feast arrived with all the grandeur Set had promised. The great hall glittered with divine radiance as gods and mortals mingled together in celebration. Isis, Osiris's beloved wife and sister, sat beside him, radiant in her beauty and completely unaware of the trap being woven around them. Nephthys, Set's own wife, but also Osiris's secret admirer, tried to hide her growing unease as she watched her husband play the perfect host. Set had invited 72 conspirators to the feast, each one carefully chosen for their grievances against Osiris or their loyalty to Set. Some were jealous gods who felt overshadowed by Osiris's perfection, others were mortal nobles who resented divine rule, and a few were simply beings who thrived on chaos and destruction. Together, they formed a web of conspiracy that would ensure Set's plan couldn't fail. As the evening reached its peak, Set stood and called for attention. His voice boomed across the hall as he gestured toward the magnificent sarcophagus. now unveiled in all its glory. He announced that this masterpiece would be given as a gift to whoever fit inside it most perfectly. It seemed like a harmless game, the kind of entertainment that gods might enjoy after too much divine wine. One by one, the guests tried the sarcophagus. Some were too short, others too tall, some too wide, others too narrow. Each failure was met with laughter and good-natured ribbing, as if this were nothing more than an amusing diversion. But Set's eyes never left his brother, watching and waiting for the moment when Osiris's curiosity would overcome his caution. Finally, as Set knew he would, Osiris approached the beautiful chest. The craftsmanship was so exquisite, the artistry so perfect, that even a god couldn't resist examining it more closely. The hieroglyphs seemed to glow in the torchlight, telling stories of eternal life and divine protection. The gold inlays caught and reflected the light like captured stars. It truly was a masterpiece worthy of the king of the gods. "Brother," Set called out, his voice carefully modulated to sound casual, almost bored. "Surely you must try it. After all, if anyone deserves such a magnificent resting place, it would be our beloved king." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning that only Set fully understood. Around the hall, conversations quieted as gods and mortals alike turned to watch their king approach what they believed was simply an elaborate piece of art. None of them could see the trap being sprung. None of them understood that they were about to witness the end of an age of peace and prosperity. Osiris smiled at his brother's words, that same warm, trusting smile that had characterized their entire relationship. Even now, even with conspiracy swirling around him like invisible smoke, Osiris saw only the brother he had grown up with, the sibling he had tried so hard to include and understand despite their differences. Without hesitation, Osiris stepped forward and lowered himself into the sarcophagus. The fit was absolutely perfect, as if the chest had been molded around his divine form. For a brief moment, he lay there peacefully, his eyes closed, a slight smile playing across his lips as he appreciated the exquisite craftsmanship surrounding him. The silence in the great hall was complete, broken only by the soft flickering of torches and the distant sound of the Nile flowing through the night. Then Set gave the signal. What happened next unfolded with the terrible precision of a nightmare. The 72 conspirators moved as one, rushing toward the sarcophagus with coordinated brutality. Before Osiris could react, before he could even open his eyes, the heavy lid slammed down above him with a sound like thunder. The beautiful chest that had seemed like a work of art moments before now became a prison, trapping the king of the gods in ornate darkness. But Set wasn't finished. This wasn't just imprisonment. This was execution. As Osiris pounded against the lid from within, his muffled cries echoing through the suddenly silent hall, Set's followers began sealing the sarcophagus with molten lead. The metal poured into every crack and crevice, creating an airtight tomb that no amount of divine strength could break open from the inside. The guests who weren't part of the conspiracy stood frozen in horror, unable to process what they were witnessing. Gods don't die. Not like this. Not through treachery and suffocation in the darkness of a sealed box. But as the minutes stretched on and Osiris's struggles grew weaker, the impossible became undeniably real. They were watching the murder of a god, and none of them had the power to stop it. Isis screamed, a sound that shattered crystal goblets, and made the very walls of the palace tremble. She threw herself against the sarcophagus, her divine magic crackling around her like lightning as she tried desperately to break the seals that held her husband captive. But Set had planned too well. The lead had hardened. The conspirators held her back, and the beautiful chest had become an impenetrable tomb. When Osiris's struggles finally ceased, when the last muffled cry faded into terrible silence, Set smiled. But his victory celebration was short-lived, because now he faced a new problem. He had the body of his brother, but what should he do with it? Burying it would create a shrine, where Osiris's followers could gather and potentially plot revenge. Burning it might release Osiris's divine essence back into the world. And keeping it would provide constant evidence of his crime. So Set chose the most brutal option imaginable. He would not just hide the body, he would destroy it so completely that Osiris could never return, never be whole, never again threaten Set's claim to the throne of Egypt. What happened next was so horrific that even the ancient texts struggle to describe it fully, speaking in whispers and metaphors about deeds too dark for direct telling. Set transported the sealed sarcophagus to a secret location far from the palace, far from witnesses, far from anyone who might interfere with his gruesome work. There, under the light of a blood-red moon, he broke open the chest that had become his brother's tomb. Osiris's body lay inside, perfect in death as it had been in life, but Set's madness was just beginning. Using a blade forged from meteoric iron, Set began to dismember his brother's corpse. But this wasn't just mutilation. This was systematic destruction designed to prevent any possibility of resurrection. Ancient Egyptian magic was powerful, but it required an intact body to work properly. Set intended to scatter Osiris so completely across Egypt that no amount of divine intervention could ever piece him back together. The number of pieces varies depending on which ancient source you consult. Some say 14, others claim 42, and a few insist there were as many pieces as there were nomes or provinces in Egypt, but all agree on the horrific thoroughness of Set's work. Every limb was severed, every organ removed, every part of Osiris's divine form reduced to separate components that Set then scattered across the length and breadth of Egypt. Some pieces were buried in sacred groves, others sunk in the deepest parts of the Nile, still others hidden in tombs and temples where they would be guarded by Set's loyal followers. The head was sent to one province, the heart to another, the limbs distributed like macabre gifts to different corners of the kingdom. Set kept only one piece for himself, the most intimate and symbolic part of Osiris's body, which he cast into the Nile to be devoured by fish, ensuring it could never be recovered. With his brother's body scattered like seeds across Egypt, Set proclaimed himself the new king of the gods. He moved into Osiris's palace, claimed his brother's throne, and began reshaping the kingdom according to his own chaotic vision. Gone were the days of abundance and harmony. Under Set's rule, the desert began to encroach on fertile lands. Storms became more violent and unpredictable, and the careful balance between order and chaos that Osiris had maintained began to collapse. But Set had made a critical error in his calculations. He had accounted for Osiris's power, for the loyalty of his followers, even for the possibility of divine intervention. What he hadn't considered was the determination of a goddess whose love transcended death itself. Isis, the wife and sister of Osiris, refused to accept that her husband was gone forever. Where Set saw final victory, Isis saw only the beginning of her greatest challenge. The goddess of magic and motherhood began a quest that would take her the length and breadth of Egypt, searching for every scattered piece of her beloved husband. This wasn't just a journey of love. It was an act of defiance against the very nature of death itself. Isis believed that if she could gather all the pieces of Osiris's body, if she could reassemble what Set had destroyed, then her magic might be powerful enough to bring him back from the realm of the dead. The search took years, decades even, as Isis traveled in disguise among mortals and gods alike, following rumors and whispers, consulting oracles and wise women, using every scrap of magical knowledge at her disposal to locate the scattered remains. Sometimes she found pieces buried beneath temples, other times floating in remote stretches of the Nile, occasionally hidden in the homes of Set's followers who had been trusted with guarding them. Each discovery brought both joy and sorrow. Joy at finding another piece of her beloved, sorrow at seeing what had been done to him. But Isis never wavered, never gave up, never accepted that death might be stronger than love. She was aided in her quest by her sister Nephthys, Set's own wife, who had secretly loved Osiris and now sought to make amends for her husband's crimes. Together, the two goddesses slowly, painstakingly, began to reassemble the scattered god. They found his head in the marshes of the delta, his hands buried beneath a sacred sycamore tree, his feet hidden in a cave in the cliffs above the Nile. Piece by piece they gathered what Set had destroyed, each fragment bringing them closer to completing their impossible task. But as their search neared its end, they faced a terrible realization. One piece was missing, the most intimate part of Osiris's body that Set had cast into the Nile to be devoured by fish. Without it, their reconstruction would be incomplete, their magic potentially ineffective. The fish had indeed consumed this final piece, making it impossible to recover through any normal means. Isis, however, was the goddess of magic, and normal means had never limited her before. Using her divine powers, she crafted a replacement from clay and sacred oils, fashioning it with such skill and imbuing it with such powerful enchantments that it became more real than the original had ever been. This act of creative magic would prove crucial to what came next, for it demonstrated that love and will could literally reshape reality itself. With Osiris's body finally complete, Isis began the most complex magical working ever attempted by god or mortal. She wrapped the reassembled corpse in linen bandages, each layer inscribed with spells of protection and resurrection. She anointed every part with sacred oils, spoke words of power that made the very air shimmer with divine energy, and called upon every god who had ever loved Osiris to lend their strength to her working. The resurrection ritual took place in secret, hidden from Set's eyes in a sacred grove protected by powerful enchantments. As Isis worked her magic, the boundaries between life and death began to blur. The wrapped figure of Osiris began to glow with an inner light. His chest started to rise and fall with the rhythm of breathing. And slowly, impossibly, the greatest of all gods began to return from the realm of the dead. But this resurrection was unlike anything that had ever happened before in the history of gods and mortals. When Osiris opened his eyes, they held a new depth, a wisdom born from experiencing the ultimate mystery that even gods had never understood. He had crossed the threshold that separated life from death and returned with knowledge of both realms. His skin, once the rich black of fertile earth, now held an otherworldly pallor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This was not merely a return to life. This was a transformation into something entirely new. The moment Osiris drew his first breath in his restored body, the very fabric of reality shifted. The ancient Egyptians believed that this single act of resurrection created the afterlife itself. Before this moment, death had been final even for gods. But Osiris's return from the void opened a doorway between worlds that would never again be fully closed. He had become the first being to conquer death, and in doing so, he had fundamentally altered the cosmic order. Yet even as Isis celebrated her impossible victory, she realized that her husband could not simply return to his old life. The trauma of death and dismemberment had changed him in ways that went far deeper than the physical. Osiris spoke now in whispers, as if his voice carried secrets from the realm of shadows. His touch, once warm with life-giving power, now felt cool and distant. He was alive, yes, but he was also forever marked by his journey through death. Set's reaction to his brother's resurrection was immediate and violent. The god of chaos had tasted absolute power during Osiris's absence, and he would not give it up without a fight. When news reached him that his supposedly dead brother walked again, Set flew into a rage that shook the foundations of his palace. How dare they defy the natural order? How dare they undo his perfect crime? This was not just political rivalry anymore. This was a war between the fundamental forces of existence itself. But Osiris surprised everyone, including his own followers, with his response to Set's fury. Rather than seeking immediate revenge, rather than reclaiming his earthly throne through force, the resurrected god made a choice that would echo through eternity. He announced that he would not return to rule the world of the living. Instead, he would become king of the dead, ruler of the afterlife that his own death and resurrection had created. This decision sent shockwaves through both divine and mortal realms. The other gods struggled to understand how Osiris could abandon his rightful place among the living. His followers wept, believing their beloved king was rejecting them. Even Isis questioned whether her husband had truly returned or if something else had taken his place. But Osiris's logic was both profound and terrifying in its implications. He explained that his death had shown him the ultimate injustice. Every mortal who died faced the unknown alone, without guidance, without hope of continuation. But now, having experienced death himself and conquered it, Osiris could offer something that had never existed before: the promise that death was not the end. He would establish a realm where the worthy dead could find eternal life, where justice would finally be served, where the suffering of earthly existence could be transformed into everlasting peace. The underworld that Osiris created was unlike anything the ancient world had ever imagined. This wasn't a gloomy prison for the dead, but a perfected version of Egypt itself. Rivers of crystal-clear water flowed through fields of grain that never failed, beneath skies that never grew dark. The blessed dead could continue their lives there, reuniting with loved ones, pursuing their crafts, living in harmony under Osiris's just rule. But this paradise came with a price: judgment. Osiris established the most complex and thorough system of divine justice ever conceived. Every soul that entered his realm would face the weighing of the heart, where their earthly deeds would be measured against the feather of truth. Those found worthy would join the blessed in eternal life. Those found wanting would face a second death, this time permanent and absolute. Osiris, who had experienced both death and resurrection, understood better than anyone the true weight of these choices. The judgment hall that Osiris created became the stuff of legend, a vast chamber where the god himself sat on a throne, made from the bones of chaos itself, wrapped in burial linens that gleamed like starlight. Before him stood the golden scales where hearts were weighed, tended by Anubis, the jackal-headed god who had helped Isis in her search for Osiris's scattered remains. Around the walls stood 42 judges, each one responsible for examining a different aspect of moral behavior. But perhaps the most terrifying presence in that hall was Ammit, the devourer of hearts. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. This creature waited beside the scales to consume the hearts of those found unworthy. Unlike the merciful death that mortals experienced in the living world, being devoured by Ammit meant complete annihilation of the soul, an ending so final that even the gods feared it. This was Osiris's gift to justice, the promise that evil would not simply be punished, but utterly destroyed. And so the god who was murdered and dismembered became the eternal judge of every soul that would ever draw breath. Osiris's story doesn't end with his resurrection. It begins there. Every mummy wrapped in linen was following his example. Every tomb filled with treasures was preparing for his judgment. Every prayer whispered in the darkness was calling upon the king who conquered death itself. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that the ancient Egyptians believed this wasn't just mythology. It was the literal truth about what awaits us all. Osiris sits on his throne right now, they thought, waiting to weigh your heart against that feather of truth. The god who died screaming in a sealed coffin, who was butchered and scattered like refuse, who clawed his way back from absolute nothingness, now holds the keys to eternity itself. This is why the story of Osiris matters, why it haunted an entire civilization for thousands of years. It's the ultimate promise and the ultimate threat, wrapped into one terrifying package. Death is not the end, but what comes after depends entirely on how you've lived. Sweet dreams. And remember, somewhere in the darkness between worlds, the first god to die and rise again is still watching, still judging, still ruling his kingdom of the dead. If this journey into the depths of Egyptian mythology kept you awake tonight, there's so much more darkness waiting to be explored. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which ancient horror story you want me to uncover next.